machine learning of defects and Laves phases and would like to welcome you to this presentation. So presentation will be mainly done by Christoph and myself, but the work presented is mainly by the colleagues mentioned here, Jan Jansen, Lingwang, and Ali Senegani. So our agenda for today consists of 3 major parts. We will start with speaking a bit about the relevance of defects and materials. Then we will focus on one material system, niobium-rich iron niobium alloys, and the main part is here to speak about machine learning concepts. And then we will conclude with a discussion of the consequences for defect thermodynamics. The first and the third part will be covered by me, the intermediate part will be covered by Christoph. And at the end, we would also like to make you familiar a bit with our integrated development environment, which we use to do these kind of calculations. As you certainly know, materials have a hierarchical structure. No matter whether you approach a material science problem from an application or from an atomistic point of view, the microscope is microcosmos of defects, such as grain boundaries, precipitates, dislocations. That's where the music plays. And that is usually what you are aiming for in order to understand the performance of materials. Yeah, and these defects actually control the functional and in particular also the mechanical performance of materials. Think about a crash test, for instance. Here, for an example of a high manganese steel, then the strengthening effect in such a material is due to the so-called Hall patch effect. And this tells us that the motion of dislocation is hindered by obstacles, and these obstacles are these kind of defects. This can be various kinds of defects, depending also on the deformation mechanism. If you think about transformation-induced plasticity, then we locally change the crystal structure to formation of a martensite. If you think about twinning-induced plasticity, then we introduce planar defects into our structure in terms of twin boundaries. That means defects are essential in order to understand materials behavior. To predict the presence of these defects and the deformation mechanisms I have just mentioned, the Steckenford energy turns out to be a very good descriptor. The Steckenford energy describes the energy needed in order to replace half of a crystal with respect to the other half. And this can be done on a 2-dimensional plane, and this gives rise to a 2-dimensional energy surface for the energy you need to pay in order to make this kind of displacement. Often, however, we are only interested in the minimum of the energy surface, and this is then called Steckenford energy. Within an ICME approach, this kind of information, which we can determine from ab initio calculations, for instance, can be transferred to larger scales. So what we need are constitutive laws for crystal plasticity, as they are, for instance, implemented in the MUST code, which is also an in-house MPIE software development. And then with this information, you get access to the material's behavior. Important is, however, that it's often not only one absolute value you would like to use in such kind of multi-scale simulation. Much more important is actually the dependence of this descriptor, Steckenford energy in this case, on thermodynamic parameters. Something like temperature dependence or dependent on local chemistry. And this makes materials so interesting, this kind of multi-component, multi-physical nature of defects actually. Let me go a bit more into this example of high manganese steels, and I would like to share with you a fantastic experimental atom probe tomography result for these high and medium manganese steels. And what you see here is the manganese distribution in a sample, in particular manganese distribution at the grain boundary. So what is observed is a segregation of manganese to grain boundaries, but it's not just a homogeneous segregation, but there seems to be something like a spinodal decomposition at the grain boundary. You have regions at the grain boundary which show a manganese content above 12%, and you have other regions where the manganese content is much lower. Yeah, that's very fascinating because it means that you have basically for the same grain boundary different defect states or defect phases present. And furthermore, it's interesting that the change of local chemistry also has an impact on magnetism. Change in manganese content by a few percent dramatically changes the Curie temperature, the magnetic ordering temperature. And this has an effect on the local stress and strain state due to the magnetostructural coupling. This can give even rise to intergranular fracture, but even if there's no fracture, this kind of stress strain state has also an impact on local chemistry. And we have to take this kind of zoo of different aspects, this multiphysical nature into account also if we want to do simulations. Yeah, in a simulation of such kind of defect phenomenon, we need to have tools to consider grain boundaries. We need to have tools to consider magnetic disorder. We need to have tools that allow us to, for given magnetic snapshot or actually superposition of different magnetic snapshots, to get atomic forces. And we need to have tools then to make a structure optimization and to get back to chemical position of elements. And only if you take this full combination of different effects into account and take this kind of combination of tools into account, then you have a chance to describe something like defect formation energy with very good agreement to experiment. If you are having an incomplete description, then you can be far off from the experimental results. One promising approach actually to handle this complexity is machine learning approaches. And we have used machine learning approaches meanwhile for all these aspects which I have mentioned. We have used machine learning approaches in order to handle the complex multidimensional space of magnetic structures. We have used machine learning approaches in order to understand the chemical distribution at given defects like grain boundaries. But in the presentation today, we would like to focus on machine learning approaches used in order to get information about the structure itself. And the material system we have chosen for this are Laves phases, iron niobium Laves phases. And this is also because they show a very interesting behavior here. So you see here a typical sample of such kind of iron 2 niobium Laves phase. And then it is compared with a situation where there's a bit of additional niobium in the sample. So you have an off stoichiometry. And what you observe is processing conditions are more or less the same, but the microstructure is completely different. You have a lot of additional defects due to the slight change in the chemistry. Yeah, and this is something which is, because of the essential role of defects, of course, very interesting to understand. And so that is one aspect. The other aspect is that also we see from experiments that we have a segregation of this additional niobium to the defects, and the question would be, what is the interplay of chemistry and defects? And that's something we wanted to understand.
Good. At this point, I will take over. You have seen already, let's just say, a few of these micrographs obtained from electron microscopy, and in particular the scanning transmission electron microscopy that we also have in-house and that is also advertised in this nice film, is a very useful tool for identifying these microstructures really down to the atomic scale. And this is very interesting also for us who are doing simulations, because this is very often where we have to understand why chemistry and these defects interact in peculiar ways. One of the advantages of scanning transmission electron microscopy is that you have many different channels to detect how the electron beam that rasters over the sample interacts with material. And one of these detectors also allows to tell something about the elemental distribution. This is the EDS detector. Now, with all these sort of say nice detectors and the scanning possibilities, of course, you produce huge amounts of data. Yeah? So a single experiment that runs for, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes can easily produce a few gigabytes of data. And if with this lot of data that you have, the question is, of course, how do you figure out what is now interesting there? Yeah? How do you look at this? Yeah? You can't look at gigabytes of data by hand. And in particular, in this very material, we were looking for the chemistry-induced changes in the crystalline patterns. Now, here you see two examples of an atomic resolution stem signal. That's actually the high angular dark field detector. So the higher the electron number, the stronger the contrast. And in the left case, you see immediately that there is a defect. Yeah? There's this whitish region here that actually comes from strain, not from chemistry, that highlights where this defect is located. If you look at the right-hand picture, you would not immediately see that there is any defects at all. Yeah? It all looks a very regular structure. And with the naked eye, it's very difficult. It is very difficult to see that there are any defects. And the question is, if you have now this not only as a single picture, but maybe tens or hundreds or thousands of them, how are you going to figure out where to look at? And this is exactly where machine learning comes into play, because machine learning is perfectly capable of discovering patterns that you have in the data. And the interesting thing here is that, of course, we are not interested in detecting any patterns at all. Yeah? So we do care about certain types of patterns that are defined by the material science context that we have here. So if you would just run a naive machine learning algorithm on such a simple picture, it might detect that there is these white blobs, yeah? Which corresponds to the atomic columns seen by the electron microscope. But of course, this is something why I don't need a machine learning algorithm to discover this. This is something that I can look up in a textbook. This is why I do these experiments in the first place. Yeah? Or you will also discover that they're regularly arranged. Yeah? But this is, again, something that we already know because we're talking about crystalline structures. So this is something that you can look up in a textbook. You don't need to discover this. Yeah? So the important thing when you want to use machine learning in a material science context, of course, is that you need to discover the stuff that you do not know yet. Yeah? So to design really algorithms that solve particular problems in material science and not just standard approaches that will dig out anything. Yeah? In this particular case, as I mentioned before, it's really about digging out different crystalline patterns and then mark those regions with the different patterns of the same pattern in the original image so that we can then have a closer look and understand what is going on. And this brings us back to material science and a little bit thinking about what are we actually looking for. And if you think about it, wait, let's probably at first have a quick look over the overall algorithm. So what we basically have is an input image. Here, in this case, a 2D grayscale intensity map. What we are going to do is to use some local descriptors to describe how this pattern looks like. And then there comes basically a standard machine learning machinery. We do a dimension reduction, which I'll explain in a minute. And we do clustering analysis, then to take apart these descriptors into distinct features. And then we use these distinct features to map out where these features are prominent. Now, this first step is to really identify the crystallinity. Yeah? And for this, we can make use of the fact that these image crystals are self-similar. Yeah? That comes from the underlying crystalline symmetries that there are there. Of course, the translational symmetry, but also rotations or reflections, whatever you have in your particular crystal. And if you image then these three-dimensional crystalline symmetries in a 2D manner, they are projected down to 2D symmetries. This is the interesting features in our experimental image that we can use to see and differentiate then the crystals. But knowing that there are these symmetries is one thing, finding them is another thing. Yeah? So the first question is, how do we actually teach a machine to tell us what kind of symmetries we have? In particular, taking into account that the images can be very noisy. Yeah? So it's not like a mathematical symmetry where you say, okay, so you take this patch of the image, you displace it by a certain amount, and what you get out is exactly the same. Yeah? it will not be exactly the same. It will only be very, very similar. And so we have to quantify these similarity. And for the quantifying similarity, again, we can go back to standard approaches and say, okay, there's, for example, the Pearson correlation coefficient that works for any data set that you can basically enumerate the values, and it more or less boils down to a simple scalar product of the data just put together as a vector. So taking this Pearson correlation coefficient for measuring the similarity between a patch of the image and the transformed patch possible symmetry operations gives you a measure of how similar this image is under this transformation, and in that sense provides us with this kind of local symmetry score if we would try to apply these questions. And this is visualized a little bit here on the right-hand side, where we've used translational symmetries and used a high value when the images are very similar, and a low value, -1, when they're kind of opposite. And if they're uncorrelated, they're basically boiled down to 0. And you very clearly see this regular repetitive units by these high peaks or high values for a certain translation, which correspond more or less to the lattice vectors of these 2D crystalline patterns. Now, once you have identified for a single patch what the local symmetries are, you basically build up a local descriptor for one patch by trying out just many different possible candidate symmetries. And in this way, you get basically a vector of descriptors for a single point, or actually a single patch in your image. The next step is now to use this not only for one spot in the image, but really to take many patches from the image and thus generate from the original just 2D image a large data set which contains and encodes the image symmetries, local symmetries that are contained in this image in a kind of machine learning ready version. And once you have this, you end up with a large data set. Yeah? For example, if we take 1,000 different patches from our image, which is not unrealistic, but if you boil it down, it's basically taking 30 by 30 patches from all over the place. And you have something on the order of 1,000 different symmetries that you've tried out, or transformations that you've tried out, you end up with 1 million numbers. Of course, this is something that machine learning algorithm considers as a reasonable amount of data. And the first step is then to filter out the interesting stuff. And this filtering out is called dimension reduction. And one of the standard procedures to do this is called principal component analysis. For those of you who do not know what this is, roughly you try to decompose the signal from a single patch, which may have one of these, say, 1,000 components, into a few characteristic features, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 10, but not more, not thousands, just a few of them, and measure the similarity of your patch to these features by certain coefficients, and instead of having then 1,000 numbers per patch, you just sort of say store these coefficients that tell you which kind of features there are. And the way how to get from the entire data set to this reduced or simplified representation of the same data, and this is called principal component analysis. Now, this ends you up with a medium data set. You still have 1,000 patches, but only 2 to maybe 10 distinguishing features. And you can actually measure how good your features represent the original data. And then see that typically 99% of the entire data variation comes from order of 5 to 10 features. And then if you have this sort of say low dimensional space, you can actually look at the data. So here each spot basically corresponds to one patch in the most important feature spaces. Here it is 3, so we can still plot it. And you see that they somehow cluster. There's one big blob sitting over here, and then a second big blob sitting over here. And in between there is fewer of them. And we can then use, again, a standard machine learning algorithm called cluster analysis. In this case, we actually take k-means to separate this entire point clouds into separate regions, which we can assign to particular crystalline patterns. And if you put everything together and apply the entire algorithm, you can see that this boring looking image actually contains two different regions. It contains this bluish region here, which is very, very regular, and it contains this red area, which is somewhat different. If you take then a closer look, you actually see that the blue one is the periodic crystal, and you can actually, within the descriptors, identify also the unit cell of this periodic image. While in the red image, you will find a periodicity parallel, or in the horizontal direction in this case, but no such periodicity perpendicular. Instead of these regular unit cells, we have this cross-shaped features. And if you look here over at the large view, they are somewhat distributed irregularly. So this is indicative of stacking faults in this otherwise crystalline material. So in this way, we can identify that indeed in this large image, there are stacking faults that somehow seem to come with the later. And now I give back to Tilmann because he knows best how to make use of these information to understand what is going on.
Yeah, and I would like to understand it in particular now in terms of energies. Yeah, so I mentioned before that apparently we have in this material, due to chemistry, a substantial increase in the number of defects, and that needs to be related to the energy of the defects. And we would like to use ab initio information to extract this energy. But we are now using the structural information, and in particular the identification of what are interesting structures from machine learning, and now continue with this ab initio analysis. So in particular, as already indicated by Christoph, in the structures, stacking faults are somehow typically represented by this kind of cross-shape arrangement of niobium atoms. And to understand this kind of feature better, let's have a look at the crystal structure of the C14 lava space we are here investigating. And this is represented here. If we decompose the structure a bit, then we have basically layers which are only consisting of these iron atoms. These are the so-called Kagome layers. And then we have layers which is a multi-layer, triple layer, large, small, large arrangement of atoms combining niobium and iron atoms. So that's the C14 phase. That means in the phase diagram, we are speaking about the phase given here at 1/3 niobium content. We have actually in our system, as indicated earlier, an enrichment of niobium. That means we are slightly off the stability region of the Laves phase. From this phase diagram, we would now expect that we have phase separation into C14 and the next phase, which is here in the phase diagram, that's the mu phase. If you look in the mu phase crystal structure, that's actually very similar to the C14 crystal structure that's represented here. Again, we have this Kagome layers, we have this sandwich layers, but we have this LLL, large, triple layers, which have this characteristic feature of the stacking forge, which we indicated earlier. So it seems that there is a certain stacking sequence for C14, a very similar stacking sequence for mu phase, but with an additional structural feature, and this seems to be also relevant for this stacking forge. And now the question is a bit for us, is it actually really a formation of another bulk phase, mu phase, or it's actually more just a planar defect, perhaps with an enrichment of niobium to take care of the additional niobium. So we have some kind of competition in this material system of bulk phase properties and planar defects. And one example also for a planar defect is here a synchro shear, which is actually a stoichiometric defect. And I will come back to this as typical planar defect. Yeah. So in order to study this kind of competition of bulk versus defect thermodynamics, we need, first of all, in order to perform a calculation, to make absolutely sure we are speaking about the right structure. We have learned a lot about what are the structural features from machine learning. The problem is that the SDM images which have been used for machine learning are just a projection onto a 2D plane. We need to get more information about the structure. For this, we use this concept of this generalized stack-and-forth energy, which we have mentioned at the beginning already. That means we have done a shifting of the two half crystals and determine the energy surface. There are certain points here which are high symmetry structures, where no matter from which direction you look at, you get 60-degree changes of angles. You get the same kind of structure. And then you have the structures along this orange line where at least one projection, and that's the projection C in SDM, is in agreement with what we see in the experiment, but another projection may not be. And so we have to find here along this line then the minimum structure, which is the structure which is represented also by the experimental samples. Yeah, so we need to do this additional structure analysis using more knowledge than is accessible for SDM, and that means also accessible to the machine. Then we need also, when we speak about the energetics of defects, need to take care of magnetism. So again, perhaps here I start now with discussing the kind of standard defect, stacking-forth defect in the C14 Laves phase. This is a synchro shear. So we have this typical arrangement of the layers as discussed before. In the synchro shear, just you have the shuffling of two layers. That's actually the typical arrangement of C14. That's the feature which you also have in the other Laves phase C15. That means determining the energy of this kind of synchro shear, you actually need to compare the energies of C14 and C15. When it turns out that this can have a strong temperature dependence, this energy difference, here going from positive to negative, and you have to take care of the temperature in order to have a good description of the actual stacking-forth energy. But you also have to take care about magnetism. This is a non-magnetic calculation. You could also think about magnetically ordered structures, and each phase has its own magnetic order. I don't want to discuss details. The corresponding stacking-forth energy would here be negative everywhere, an indication actually that C14 would be unstable. But in magnetically ordered structures also not what is reality. Reality is that actually we have a paramagnetic situation, and then we get positive stacking-forth energies throughout the relevant temperature regime. That's the magnetic aspect which needs to be also taken into account. And then we can really do the thermodynamic evaluation. So we can look into the convex hull, here shown first for the two bulk phases, C14 and mu phase, which are occurring the phase diagram. And we compare this now with structures which contain these defects, planar defects, stacking-forth, these different kind of flavors of stacking-forth which are possible. In order to now look into the stability, we assume a certain defect density and keep this fixed. This is the only way of being able to compare bulk with defect properties. And what we need to compare is such a defect which contains additional niobium with the synchro shear defect, where the additional niobium contact is taken care of by just bulk mu phase. We actually do it in a way that we take the same chemical potential of niobium as we have it in the phase separation case. We take a parallel line to this one, and we need to compare this energy of such a stacking-forth with such a scenario where we have niobium-free defects and a mu phase in addition. We have to rescale results to the proper composition. So we have 35% niobium and makes this comparison actually for this composition. And then this energy difference between these 2 points tells us something about the relative stability of a defect with respect to the bulk phase separation. Yeah. And this can be done now for the different kinds of planar defects also observed in experiment and identified also by machine learning. And typically we get that the defect formation energy is actually above the bulk energies. But if we actually take into account that the mu phase will not form as an individual phase somewhere, but if it forms then as a precipitate constrained by the matrix, then the situation looks actually differently. And this kind of constrained reference system is giving rise to actually formation energies of the planar defects compared to the constrained bulk phases, which are energetically favorable. And that means we do understand that adding niobium, that means changing the chemistry, changes completely the defect state. You have niobium-rich defects and changes the stability of this defect. And this is a completely new understanding now of thermodynamics. You have to make phase diagrams and thermodynamics for defects, taking care of the chemical and temperature degrees of freedom. Okay, with this I would like to summarize by looking back a bit more on the simulation point of view, and outlining here that the challenge which we had for the simulations of defects with the multiphysics aspects, nature of these defects, is this multiple set of different tools which we have to take care of. And we need actually tools for the simulation as well as for the interpretation of the experimental data. And we have developed for this an integrated development environment, which allows us with a user-friendly interface to perform simulation protocols, such that we have a software framework for all the tools which we need, all the simulation tools, but also the experimental tools, in particular for the characterization of experiments or of experimental samples. And in the same framework for both kinds of sites, we can then use, for instance, machine learning approaches in order to analyze the data. Yeah, so it means we are speaking about generalized generic simulation protocols where a user thinks about a certain materials model, thinks about a project in order to analyze this model, and then this project has some generic input and output, but also code-specific kind of interaction with all the different codes. This is taken care of by our simulation environment in an automized manner. Also the validation or collection of data, the analysis of data, this can be done automized, and we only as a user again would like to look at the final result and interpret this result in order also to validate and the materials model with which we have started. So that's the framework of computer simulations which we are doing in a digital materials environment. There's another keyword here that's ontologies. So one would need to understand to combine materials knowledge, which is stored in ontologies, with simulation protocols, and that's what we are pushing forward at the moment. With this slide, I would like to finish this presentation. And since we perhaps still have a few minutes, I could use this time to speak a bit more about this simulation environment which we are using here. Just to show you a bit more in practice what this means. That's also to make a bit of advertisement for this. Just a few minutes, few impressions. So that's the typical screenshot of such a session in Python. So we do use standard web browsers in order to start Jupyter notebooks. I guess many of you have already dealt with Jupyter notebooks, so we use it also for our purposes. It means everything is in Python, and within such a Jupyter Lab session, we can do the management of all our projects, we can do all the visualization, we can do data management, but also we can do machine learning approaches as they are shown here. Yeah, so you are invited to look into our web page, python.org. Perhaps we can quickly switch also to this web page. So in this case, melting point calculation. So for melting point calculation, you need to handle solid and liquid together in an interface, and then see at which temperature this interface is stable. That means we have a certain workflow from the materials model point of view, how to access something like a melting temperature. I don't want to describe now the material science so much in detail, but the notebook would then look like this. It does look like this. Yeah, you need some libraries. You start a Python project. You set up your structure. You can immediately visualize the structure. Then you can choose your The simulation scheme, it means your empirical potential here for simulations. You can have a list of different available potentials. You choose one, you set your temperature, and you run your calculations. And you have every day all the data connected to your calculations according to the FAIR principles. Means by using such notebooks, you ensure that your data are later findable, accessible. Interoperable means you can do Laves calculation or DFT calculation, just replace one atomistic simulation scheme by another one and rerun the same calculation. And this makes also all the data reusable. Yeah, and immediately afterwards, you can do any kind of analysis, model validation to look into your data. And you can combine the whole scheme of calculating a melting point into one notebook. You go to script shop and submit the whole notebook to high performance computing resources in order to do then also high throughput studies and get the proper statistics for getting your melting point, for instance.